I want to welcome everyone today to the start of the symposium or conference, whatever you want to call it, Jonathan Swift and the 21st Century. For those of you who were not here last night, I'm Lynn Farrington. I'm Senior Curator here in the Kislak Center, and along with my co-organizers, Tony Bowers, Michael Gamer, and Suvir Kaul, we want to welcome you today to what we think will be a wonderful conference. We're looking forward to some great papers. We're looking forward to graduate student involvement. And with that, without further ado, I want to hand it over to Michael Gamer, who is actually chairing the first session. Michael?
Hi there all, and welcome. If you start with me in weather like this, there's only one way, and that's up. And I also wanted to say, right after saying welcome, it's really great to see you, that I've been instructed by Suvir Kaul to say, turn off your cell phones. Since I know that I've never seen that happen to him, and he was mortified. So I'm not going to talk much. I'm just going to introduce our first two speakers. And again, my job's been done even better than I could have done it by Lynn, who has supplied their bios in the program. And yet I am going to do a very dramatic reading of them aloud. Our first speaker is Paula McDowell, who is Associate Professor of English at New York University. And she specializes in 18th century British literature and media and in the history of the book. She's had the support of fellowships from the American Council of Learned Societies, the American Philosophical Society, the National Humanities Center, and the National Endowment for the Humanities. And that list alone has given me some ideas for what I might do this coming fall in the way of applications. She's published 3 books: Women of Grub Street, Press, Politics, and Gender in the London Literary Marketplace from Oxford in 1998, Eleanor James' Printed Writings from Ashgate in 2005, and a new book, which I'm looking forward to reading, The Invention of the Oral, Print Commerce, and Fugitive Voices in 18th Century Britain, which has come out from Chicago in 2016, and examines the oral literate, not literary, but oral and literate binary as a heuristic, i.e. a tool for understanding itself as history, and argues that the concept of oral culture was in fact a back formation for the explosion of print commerce. She is currently working on a book on the Canadian professor, scholar, and media theorist Marshall McLuhan. And our second speaker, it gives me great pleasure to introduce David Alf, Assistant Professor of English at SUNY Buffalo, where he teaches courses in 18th century studies. He is the author of the very recent book, The Wreckage of Intentions, Projects in British Culture, that Penn published last year, and is currently working on a new book that I want to read, and he hasn't finished it, so I'm currently angry at him, that's called Rights of Way, which investigates, and I'm quoting here, how societies determine what people, goods, and ideas can traverse which physical spaces. For those of you who read PMLA, and I actually do, I'm ashamed to say, but I do, he has a current article in it, and it makes the whole issue worth reading. It's actually a good issue. There's another on Georgian public works, also forthcoming from ELH. So we'll start with Paula, and welcome.
As this morning's first speaker, I'm sure I speak for all of the presenters, or I suspect I do, in expressing our great gratitude to Lynn Farrington and to Michael and Suvir and Tony and everybody else who put together this amazing opportunity. It's just incredibly exciting to be here to talk about Swift for 2 days. I'd also like to give a shout out to the editors of the Cambridge edition of the works of Jonathan Swift. As someone who lugged around my library's only copy of the Guth-Kelch and Smith edition of The Tale of the Tub for longer than I should probably admit in public. I'm just so grateful to have Marcus Walsh's amazing edition of Tale of a Tub. Anyway, my thinking about sound and voice in Swift began with a very simple question. Why would anyone want to write a general history of ears? The question arises pretty much immediately upon encountering Tale of a Tub. Accompanying the title page is a list of treatises written by the same author. The narrator's works include a dissertation upon the principal productions of Grub Street, an analytical discourse upon zeal, a modest defense of the proceedings of the rabble in all ages, and most strikingly for me, as someone interested in the oral, a general history of ears. A Tale of a Tub is traditionally read as a satire on print culture, and I put that phrase in quotation marks. But following Swift's hint concerning ears, I read it in the context of the simultaneous development of ideas about oral communication and the emergent science of acoustics. In his Meditations on Print Commerce, I suggest, Swift also exhibits a heightened degree of reflection on orality and its intersections with the products of a newly unrestrained press. I address this topic to some degree in Invention of the Oral, but I'd like to take things in a different direction today. This morning, I'll situate the tale in relation to ancient and early modern theories about sound and voice, and very briefly to current work in acoustomology, sensory history, and archaeoacoustics, which are all booming fields. It seems fitting to do this in Philadelphia, the site of the most famous archaeoacoustic experiment in history, Ben Franklin's experiment to determine the maximum intelligible range of Methodist leader George Whitefield's preaching voice. Franklin doubted the accounts he'd read of Whitefield addressing some 30,000 people at open-air venues in Britain. When Whitefield preached in Philadelphia in 1739, Franklin performed an experiment that archaeoacoustomologists use even today to assess the maximum range of the human voice in the pre-amplified era. Tale of a Tub was drafted in 1696 and published in 1704, and it exemplifies particular anxieties expressed in a pivotal decade in the history of the press. In 1695, the lapse of the Licensing Act ended pre-publication censorship and government restrictions on the number of printers. The same decade that saw the genesis and publication of the tale saw an exponential increase in the number of printers and presses. Whereas before 1695, the government had tried to limit the number of printers in all England to 24. 10 years later, there were about 70 printing houses in London alone. Swift associated the unlicensed press with the threat of social upheaval and even revolutionary change. Writing within living memory of 1649 and 1688, the beheading of one king and exile of another, the narrator alludes to and anticipates revolutions. But significantly, in celebrating the new liberty of the press, that's his phrase, he declares that no revolutions have been so great or so frequent as those of human ears. Swift made sense of the new world of unrestrained print commerce by linking it to familiar local practices of orality. He exhibits an intense suspicion of popular oral forms and their increasingly organized intersection with the newly available tool of print. In a set piece on oratorial machines, the speaker-narrator draws an extended analogy between genres of oral discourse and varieties of print commerce. He describes 3 machines for the use of those orators who desire to talk much without interruption: the ladder or gallows, the stage itinerant, and the pulpit. At a time of widespread illiteracy, ears and tongues remained the chief organs of mass manipulation. Accordingly, the tale-teller advises, "It is with men as it is with asses. Whoever would keep them fast must find a very good hold at their ears." As a freshly ordained clergyman, Swift foregrounded the pulpit as the most distinguished machine by which modern orators exalt themselves above the crowds. His satire focuses on the dissenting public, which symbolizes the writings of our modern saints. In 1689, the Act of Toleration allowed dissenters to worship openly. Anglicans castigated dissenters for their practice of delivering their oral testimonies in marketplaces and streets. But Anglicans also expressed concern that pulpit oratory in the established church was not competing adequately for the souls of the populace, who were being seduced by these new enthusiastic or fanatic preachers. Recent revisionary considerations of oral discourse emphasize the materiality of sound and speech. Similarly, Tale of a Tub foregrounds the materiality and corporeality of the auditory, the measurable and manipulatable qualities of sound and air, the acoustics of different spaces and places, and especially the body parts of speakers and hearers. The unique power and danger of oral communication, Swift suggests, lies in its corporeality and so universality. The tools of oral communication are rooted in the body: tongues, ears, larynx, pharynx, and so on. Throughout the tale, but especially in the set piece on oratorial machines and discussions of the learned Aeolists, he foregrounds the corporeal and otherwise material aspects of oral communication. Swift is well known for exposing mankind's overconfidence in the power and permanence of texts. But Swift scholars have tended not to notice that he equally engages with truisms about oral communication. On the one hand, he satirizes the ephemerality of Grub Street writings. On the other, he foregrounds everything that is material, corporeal, and even, in some ancient and modern theories, permanent about sound and speech. Swift satirizes both parts of the truism vox audita perit, litera scripta manet, voices heard perish, letters written endure. Swift's speaker questions why it is that for attaining attention in public, there is of necessity required a superior position of place. We still always stand. He proposes that air being a heavy body, and therefore, according to the system of Epicurus, continually descending, must needs be more so when loaden and pressed down by words, which are also bodies of weight and gravity, and therefore must be delivered from a due altitude, or else they will neither carry a good aim or fall down with sufficient force. Swift quotes Lucretius' De Rerum Natura, his 1st century BC poem attempting to convert readers to the philosophy of Epicurus. Book 4 of De Rerum Natura is devoted to a theory of the senses. Lucretius gives a particularly detailed account of sound, both sound in general and of voice, a subcategory of sound. Epicurean philosophy held that everything consists of particulate matter, atoms that swerve, collide, combine, or otherwise dance through the air. When we speak, we force voice-constituting atoms through our windpipes and out our mouths. If we speak too loud or long, this matter scrapes our throats. Swift quotes Lucretius' repeated assertion, "'Tis certain then that voice is all material, body, every sound." He actually gives that line in Latin and in English. But in quoting Lucretius, I suggest, Swift was not so much satirizing De Rerum Natura as using Epicurean materialism to engage in contemporary debates in natural philosophy. The passage on air as a heavy body is also a veritable encyclopedia of satiric references to 17th century experiments with sound, speech, and air. Swift engages with Francis Bacon and the science of acoustics, with Robert Boyle's experiments with air, the dominant medium of sound and speech, and with commentary on these scientific debates and experiments by several of his fellow clergymen, including William Wotton, the tale's most notorious critic. A word or two about 17th and 18th century notions of media and mediation, for early modern understandings of these terms differ from ours today. The word media stems from the Latin medius, or middle. Early modern authors used medium as for a connecting substance or milieu, as water is a medium for sound. Today we have the terms media and the media referring to the means of mass communication, such as radio or television, or to the human agents who make these tools work. But early modern authors used the plural mediums rather than media, and media as a collective noun for our most advanced communication technologies did not emerge until the late 19th century. From antiquity through Swift's lifetime, the senses were believed to operate by the communication or connection of organs and their objects by mediums. Philosophers believed that the operation of sound needed a medium. If that ethereal element was not the air itself, it was something like air. Well into the 19th century, when one spoke of mediums, one typically meant natural elements such as air, fire, water, and earth. As John Durham Peters points out in his book Marvelous Clouds Towards an Elemental Philosophy of Media, this meaning is preserved in the life sciences today, where medium still implies substances for growing cultures, a usage stemming from the older environmental meaning of medium. Francis Bacon wrote extensively about hearing and acoustics and what we would call oral communication. In Silva Silvarum, he wrote, "The mediums of sounds are air, soft and porous bodies, also water, and hard bodies refuse not altogether to be mediums of sounds, but all of them are dull and unapt deference except the air." Note that whereas today we might conceptualize sound or speech as media forms, for Bacon, the most common medium of sounds is air. A contemporary of Bacon, Helkia Crook, addressed the nature and workings of the medium in Microcosmographia. He worked explicitly to define what the medium is. And you can see at the top that literally the header on each page addresses the question, what the medium is. So this is his central topic. Like Bacon, Crook devoted special attention to the sense of hearing. Describing the body parts involved in speech, he illustrated with engravings the ear's intricate meanders, small particles, and nooks between the bones, as well as elements of the vocal apparatus, such as the epiglottis, larynx, and pharynx. This is just parts of the ear, let alone the epiglottis. Crook theorized the operation of the medium as part of a process of mediation. Describing the connection of the object and organ via the medium, he wrote, "As no sound is made without two bodies impeaching or offending one another," there's the idea of immediate connection, "so without the mediation of a third thing, typically air, there can no sound at all by the concussion of those bodies be produced." These ways of understanding mediums, mediation, and communication persisted throughout Swift's lifetime. A trio of terms, object, organ, and medium, became a refrain in medical, anatomical, and philosophical texts. The 18th century saw the emergence of the modern discipline of hearing science, or acoustics. Natural philosophers addressed the physiological mechanisms of hearing and the spatial and psychological factors affecting the perception of sounds. In 1737, Guichard de Verney's treatise on otology was translated as a treatise of the organ of hearing. Like his predecessors, de Verney used medius, or middle, in the context of sound and hearing. As for communication, de Verney used this word in a sense that I can't help but feel seems to anticipate its modern meaning of communication across distance versus immediate connection. He writes, "It is by the communication of the auditory nerves with that of the voice that the sympathy between the voice and the hearing is caused." Now, Swift scholars have long recognized his engagement with natural philosophy. One of his satiric targets was Robert Boyle. Boyle died in 1691, by then Swift's most famous fellow Irishman, and his death prompted widespread reassessment of his works. As I've suggested in Invention of the Oral, one prompt for Swift's General History of Ears may have been Boyle's just published General History of Air. Boyle's History of Air includes such chapters as of the air as the medium of sounds, and of sounds and noises in the air, and of the air's operation on the sounds of bodies. That's the title of one chapter. One glance at the contents alone would have provided Swift with satiric fodder for his representation of words as weighty matter, and his satire of the Aeolists, who maintain the original cause of all things to be wind. Another Boyle publication, a continuation of new experiments touching the spring and weight of the air, shows a gentleman standing on the roof of a building operating a suction pump to determine to what height water can be raised by attraction. In describing this experiment, Boyle refers repeatedly to the spring and weight of the air. His statement that the air was very heavy anticipates Swift's assertion that air is a heavy body. Swift's tale-teller extends these theories of weighty matter to another arena of oratorial and acoustic achievement. He remarks, "There is something refined in the contrivance and structure of our modern theaters. The pit is sunk below the stage, so that whatever weighty matter shall be delivered thence may fall plumb into the jaws of certain critics." While weighty matter sinks downward to the pit, interestingly, bombast and buffoonery, by nature lofty and light, float upward to the gallery, where a suitable colony greedily intercepts them with their mouths. And he riffs on this theme for quite a while. In Swift's satire, texts are ephemeral, while spoken words are weighty, material substances that hearers intercept with their ears, mouths, and jaws. But as a clergyman, Swift was, of course, most concerned with the pulpit as a tool by which orators sought to enhance their power. Similarly concerned with the acoustics of the pulpit, Bacon questioned whether sounds do move better downwards than upwards. Pulpits are placed high above the people, and when the ancient generals spake to their armies, they had ever a mount of turf cast up where they stood. Swift represents both dissenting preachers and Grub Street authors as asses with loud braying voices and enormous ears. In the Tale of a Tub, Swift's allegory of the three brothers, dissenter Jack has a tongue musculous and subtle and has mastered the art of braying like an ass. Alarmingly, though, Jack's preaching has earned him multitudes of followers and devotees. His oral adeptness has given rise to the epidemic sect of Aeolists, who affirm the gift of belching to be the noblest act of a rational creature. Jack's oracular belches stem from base bodily impulses, yet he also shrewdly manipulates aspects of oral delivery, such as gesture, tone, cadence, and pitch. His eloquence evokes a sympathetic response in the bodies of his audience, provoking them to sigh, sway, and sing. And sympathy, of course, is a key word in the 18th century. From the 5th edition on, the tale included illustrations. This image depicts a preacher elevated to a position of eminency above the inferior world. The original sketch for this illustration was not printed, and it's easy to see why. In this version, there are multiple pointed references to the material bodily stratum. The preacher is stout and gaseous. He thumps his belly and spews out a crowd of inspiration or hot air. Meanwhile, his auditories are exclaiming with wonder, spewing, and holding their guts. In the printed plate, the preacher drones and mechanically gestures to auditories who listen with different degrees of attention or turn away. But in both stages of this illustration, the preachers have sizable audiences. Swift satirized dissenters, but he also acknowledged that their seeming eloquence could have force. And here, I can't help but reminding us of Hogarth's later engraving, Credulity, Superstition, and Fanaticism, which similarly depicts a dissenting preacher's audience sympathetically responding to his style of preaching. It provokes bodily reactions in them. And one of my favorite aspects of this engraving is actually behind the preacher. An often overlooked detail is a gigantic open mouth bawling blood, blood, blood. So this is a pretty threatening image, I think. I find it quite frightening. But in choosing to print his tale, Swift embraced new tools for communication. I'll conclude by very briefly suggesting some ways archaeoacoustomologists are using new tools and methods to register, study, and communicate sound and voice. Hogarth's preacher is often held to depict Whitefield, and a similarly powerful portrait of Whitefield greets Penn staff and students today. I have not had time to seek out this statue, but I'm sure some of you recognize it from your morning commutes. Evidently, it was placed right outside a student dorm at the time, which I find rather interesting. I recently served on a dissertation committee in the music technology program at NYU. That's one thing working on sound does. It makes you eligible for more dissertation committees. But the wonderful student, Braxton Boren, used historical, archaeological, and meteorological research, as well as acoustic simulations, to investigate the range of Whitefield's voice and the accuracy of Franklin's auditory experiment. And I took this from his dissertation. He concluded that Whitefield could have reached a crowd of up to 50,000 people under ideal conditions. And let me tell you, this study was exhaustive. He took into consideration everything from the fact of crowd density, that if you have women in hoop skirts, you're going to fit less people in the crowd. I mean, he thought of everything. Last month, I attended a soundscape studies conference titled Mapping the Musical City. As I listened to experts in digital mapping describe and demonstrate new tools to map historical soundscapes, I learned terms and concepts wholly new to me, such as sonification from the Latin sonus, or sound. I kept hearing sonify. I'd never heard that verb before. I felt slightly less ignorant when I learned that this word, sonification, is officially only 7 months old. It was added to the OET last June. We all know what Swift would think of words like sonification. In his 1710 essay on the corruption of our English tongue, he complained of new words invented by pretty fellows. Even the preachers in our churches, he wrote, adopt these terms to show us that they know the town and have not been poring upon old, unfashionable books in the university. Yet even Swift knew that some degree of change is inevitable. I have done my utmost for some years, his speaker says, to stop the progress of mob and banter and words like bamboozle, but have been plainly borne down by the numbers. The language concerns and tools of scholarship are changing, and I look forward to hearing more about Swift in the 21st century today. The history of media and mediation is an ongoing one, to be sure, but as I hope to have suggested, it's also one in which our 17th and 18th century predecessors played a pivotal part. Thanks.
I'd also like to begin by thanking Lynn, Tony, Michael, Severe, John, colleagues in the library, graduate student colleagues. It is so great to have an opportunity to come back to Penn. It is always wonderful to be in Philadelphia. You probably all know this scene. 3 voyages into his adventures, Lemuel Gulliver reaches the continent of Balnibarbi. Here he finds a landscape in ruin. Decrepit buildings, wasted tillage, and weary inhabitants who, quote, walked fast and were generally in rags. All around him, Gulliver surveys busyness and poverty. The story goes that some years earlier, a delegation had ascended to the floating court of Laputa and acquired there a smattering of knowledge before returning home eager to put all arts, sciences, languages, and mechanics upon a new foot. To this end, they founded the Academy of Projectors, wherein engineers, chemists, linguists, and physicians invented, quote, new instruments and tools for trades and manufactures. Such innovation, they promised, would permit one man to do the work of 10. A palace could rise in a week and last for eternity. Fruit would ripen in the dead of winter. The problem with all of this ingenious novelty, Gulliver observes, is that, quote, none of these projects are yet brought to perfection, and in the meantime, the whole country lies miserably waste. Projects, it turns out, mortgage the society they pledge to better by disrupting conventional ways of life. Seeking its perfection through speculative gambits, society languishes. The third of Gulliver's Travels presents Balnibarbi as a cautionary tale in granting freelance visionaries the imprimatur of state power. Swift's complaint may resonate with anyone who lived during or under high modernist planning regimes from Soviet collectivization to, in my adopted home state, the as yet undismantled legacy of Robert Moses. Borrowing a phrase from the political scientist James Scott, we could say that Swift reveals, quote, how certain schemes to improve the human condition have failed. Literary critics have traditionally read the Academy's coercive blundering as a satire on the Royal Society, its scientific claims and claims to scientificity. Other proposed targets include the South Sea Company, the University of Leiden, Irish colonization, spats between ancients and moderns, and Swift himself, who advanced his own schemes to stimulate manufacturing and refine etiquette. These interpretations are individually valid, but I think that Swift is up to something bigger than mocking a particular scheme or dismembering a particular schemer. Gulliver's Travels interrogates the language and logic of the project form and the capacity of projection to construct livable futures. Projects. Today, few of us think twice about this word, which feels self-evident in the context of our goal-oriented, enterprise-driven modernity. Every day, we live in and through business projects, art projects, infrastructural super projects, home improvement projects, and the projects of self-fashioning, dramatized, and television franchises like Project Runway and the Mindy Project. Projects have embedded themselves so deeply within the cultural fabric of Western civilization that we scarcely notice their existence. Worn from use, the word feels more like a topical container than an investigatable object. Appreciating Swift's satire, however, requires us to work against our unthinking familiarity by remembering a time before projects were so ubiquitous, a time when it was possible to see the project as a thing in itself. In early modern Britain, project referred not only to the application of human faculties to improving society, but also to alchemical procedures, optical displays, informational charts, and physical motions. One could hatch a project in the sense of a plan, jot down thoughts within a table called project, or map the project or schema of a book. Project was an even more versatile verb. Things one could project included light on a surface, philosopher's stone in a cauldron, three-dimensional figures on two-dimensional planes, and any object or projectile through space. It was in the 1500s that project, in its nominal and predicate form, began to signify discrete efforts to solve society's problems. Project came to signify a plan for action and the possibility of action itself, a proposal and its execution. There were projects to wage war and peace, to build libraries and administer lotteries, to sanitize London and explore overseas territories, to enlighten some people and enslave others. Those who pitched projects promised that their schemes would enhance the nation and secure its people. Others attacked so-called projectors as dilettantes who lack the ability to complete endeavor, or pernicious charlatans who profess commonwealth for all as a screen for personal interest. The terminology of projects that today seem so impersonal and impervious could read in the 16 and 1700s as salacious invective, connoting seedy self-interest, bald-faced deceit, laziness, even lunacy. Milton's Beelzebub upbraids the Congress of Pandemonium for, quote, projecting peace and war rather than committing to action. Pope's Dunciad describes a court of dullness overrun by, quote, wild enthusiasts, projectors, politicians, inamoratos, castle builders, chemists, and poets. When Henry Stubb really wanted to stick it to the Royal Society, he called their experiments but projecting. An especially prolific author and critic of projects was Daniel Defoe, who plunged into debt investing in ventures to manufacture diving bells and farm cats for perfume. He called the 1690s a projecting age to capture its heady mixture of scheming and dreaming. Some projects, Defoe acknowledged, benefited England by employing its poor and increasing public revenue. Others, he warned, posed needless and unusual hazards. Good and bad projects abound in Defoe's novels. It is not until Robinson Crusoe's head grows, quote, full of projects and undertakings that he abandons his plantation and sets sail to buy slaves. This luckless journey ends in shipwreck on an island off Trinidad, where Robinson embarks on new projects and designs of survival, including his ultimate, quote, project of a voyage to the main. Projects for Defoe epitomize both the dangers of overreaching one's station and the virtues of self-reliance in the face of destruction. Swift obviously takes a different tack. Gulliver's Travels exposes the patterns of language that justified endeavor. His fiction shows how projects made themselves believable through words that acted upon the world, or more often failed to do so. Such failures become most palpable in the Travels when Gulliver tours the academy and encounters there a series of ridiculous experiments, making gunpowder from ice, spinning cloth from spider webs, abolishing language, etc. This is Gulliver's description of one projector who sought to retail the sunlight locked in cucumbers. The first man I saw was of a meager aspect, with sooty hands and face, his hair and beard long, ragged, and singed in several places. His clothes, shirt, and skin were all of the same color. He had been 8 years upon a project for extracting sunbeams out of cucumbers, which were to be put into vials, hermetically sealed, and let out to warm the air in raw and clement summers. He told me he did not doubt in 8 years more he should be able to supply the governor's gardens with sunshine at a reasonable rate. But, he complained, that his stock was low, and entreated me to give him something as an encouragement to ingenuity, especially since this had been a very dear season for cucumbers. This passage sounds several signature conventions of the project mode within a portrait of technological futility. Swift pushes the cucumber projector's rhetoric to the breaking point by making it rationalize a manifestly botched performance. And Paula's presentation makes me aware of the degree to which this rhetoric adheres in speech, as well as the text of the novel that we're reading. The city projector did not doubt his future success. In another chamber, it is not doubted that a scheme to replace plows with furrowing hogs will somehow work. Academy projectors negate doubt through perforce denial as their experiments grind on hopelessly. To not doubt is to shift a discourse's modal grounding from an account of how things are to an interpretation of what they might be. It is in this hazy subjunctive future that cucumber solar power tries to claim the epistemological status of fact. Brimming with assurance, the cucumber projector declares that within 8 years, he will supply sunlight to the public. Almost all 18th century project proposals claim to serve the common good. The cucumber projector pledges to heat the governor's garden at a reasonable rate. How this fair price could ever be reckoned is, of course, beside the point. By assigning future exchange value to enterprise stuck in a ceaseless present, Swift shows how projects presume the world it is their business to bring about. The projector finally complains that his stock was low, meaning that he is out of cucumbers, a noteworthy hardship given that this had been a very dear season for cucumbers. The projector frames an intractable problem of biothermal engineering in terms of monetary deficit. The project will benefit the public if only its author can have 8 years more and subsidy to re-up on gourds. This passage mocks projectors who bemoan their poverty to avoid addressing the more recondite difficulties that plagued serious endeavor, in this case, the complexities of botanical respiration. The Cucumber Man promises to reverse photosynthesis if given time and money. He collapses theoretical challenges into finite needs and ascribes false certitude to an attempted violation of natural law. By exhibiting the language of projection in an indefensible context, Swift appears to render the proposal harmless. But then it works, sort of. At the end of the scene, Gulliver gives his scorched, beragged acquaintance his requested donation. The projector's self-faith, claims of public benefit, and papering over of conceptual difficulties yields a subsidy. Gulliver claims he was just being nice. His host, after all, had given him money to bestow upon the Academy's members out of custom. This knowledge paints the Cucumber Man as a tourist attraction, perhaps even a bedlamite, as Al Rivero speculates, in a time when Londoners paid admission to watch inmates at the Hospital of St. Mary. But Swift also wants us to see how projection's uprooting of tradition has become so routine in Balnibarbi that it renders alms obligatory. Legato's projects are silly, but their justificatory rhetorics can be insidious and persuasive. While no amount of wordsmithing could pull sunbeams from cucumbers, the projector's same diction and syntax had, with considerable success, proposed projects of banking, insurance, enclosure, and poor relief throughout the early 1700s. Gulliver's Charity demonstrates how even the most absurd scheme can conceive of its success through a specious performance that renders it capable of moving matter and changing the world. Defoe claimed to inhabit an age of projects. Despite Swift's best efforts, little evidence suggests that we ever left it. Projects today are no longer an audacious invention like they were in the 18th century, but a conceptual fixture, one whose history feels settled and distant. I think that now is a good time to start remembering. Donald Trump campaigned for president upon his image as a projector of condos, casinos, airlines, mortgages, and mail-order steaks. A Wharton graduate, he built a fortune on the eroding sands of Absecon Island, partaking in Atlantic City's municipal project to sell short on the fortune-seeking of others. He later invented a fictitious academy and kept on projecting straight to the White House, conceiving of the executive branch as an incubator for border walls, pipelines, prisons, and other once-and-for-all interventions. His 55-page outline for rebuilding infrastructure in America uses the word project 362 times. Beyond Trump, Silicon Valley's hold upon private sector innovation has prompted fulsome acclaim and searching criticism. Hurricanes, earthquakes, and wildfires have prompted urban planners to rebuild and rethink communities prone to disaster. In 2018, it's hard to imagine the future arriving in any other vehicle than the project. So, what guidance can Swift's anti-project satire impart in our present age of futurism and turbulence? Gulliver's Travels apprehends the project as a distinct rhetorical formation. It teaches us to scrutinize the words in which projects coalesce. Swift's fiction furthermore registers how this rhetoric migrates across different discursive modes: pamphlets, broadsides, and epistles in his day, blogs, tweets, memes, and our own. I'll spend my final few minutes exploring the medial ecology that has sprouted up around a single iconic 21st century project. The scheme is the Hyperloop, a high-speed transportation system proposed by South African business tycoon Elon Musk. Its basic idea is to build a network of low-pressure tubes in which pods, unencumbered by air resistance, travel at high speeds. Coasting at 760 miles an hour, a pod will run between San Francisco and Los Angeles in 35 minutes, but not before the project is, in Gulliver's phrase, brought to perfection. Still in its conceptual state, the Hyperloop has already generated mountains of writing. Its most substantial document remains a 2013 white paper entitled Hyperloop Alpha. In reading it, we will not find today's projectors executing the same maneuvers as their ancestors. This is due in part due to the fact that 21st century inventors are writing in the wake of centuries of anti-project satire, a tradition obviously to which Gulliver's Travels contributed. By imitating proposal literature at its most fatuous, satire compels projectors to become more nimble and self-aware. The mode ironically winds up disciplining those it sought to dismiss. Hyperloop Alpha accordingly groans beneath the weight of its rhetorical self-consciousness. The text opens by apologizing for its language, renouncing jargon to bolster the sense that it is declaiming plain truths through transparent prose. The authors here momentarily cast off the technical language that would convey their ideas to those equipped to implement them in order to court the lay reader. This sometimes goes a bit far. Everybody follow this conceptual diagram? Hyperloop Alpha imagines its specialist readers, engineers and physicists, as potential collaborators who can flag and remedy design flaws. This passage recruits a scientific skeptic as team member through an invitation to submit fixes as feedback rather than broadcast displeasure to the world. The self-effacing call for help can distract us from the proposal's stealth attempt to exploit the controversy it provokes. The crowdsourcing topos makes readers responsible for completing the project while framing unconstructive critique as bad citizenship. The Hyperloop's architects claim to invent a new form of transportation that surpasses modes like California's high-speed rail system, which Musk really hates for a lot of reasons, which is currently under construction. At the same time, they situate this ingenuity within a lineage of visionaries, including Robert Goddard, the rocketry pioneer who first envisioned a vac train in 1904. The Hyperloop feels newfangled, but it does not come out of the blue. It comes out of history. To this end, Alpha makes a point to advocate off-the-shelf technology, including orbital welders, concrete, solar panels, and turntables, like the turntables that turn steam locomotives around, are a big part of his proposal. The Hyperloop Musk waxes will be, quote, a cross between a Concorde, a railgun, and an air hockey table. Hyperloop Alpha locates its major challenges in the familiar realms of cost, safety, and land acquisition, simplistic problems like the ones that the Cucumber Man outlined. This framing sets the stage for some pleasingly blunt suppositions. Hyperloop will be safer than trains, cheaper than planes, and run down the I-5 median. The biggest engineering obstacle, according to the authors, is what's called the Kontravitz limit, the idea that speeding pods would plow air within the tube into a dense wall. Think of a syringe. The solution, since amended, entails affixing a fan to the nose of each pod that would transfer air to the rear and in the process create a cushion that the pod could float on. Hyperloop Alpha draws persuasive force from the conversion of deficits into possibilities, the performance of problem solving that increases the credibility of the proposal as a whole. Swift accused projectors of taking for granted the world they claim to be fashioning. This charge sticks somewhat stubbornly to Hyperloop Alpha in its conclusion, which begins, a high-speed transportation system known as Hyperloop has been developed in this document. What does this passive predicate developed mean in this context? The word blurs the border between present and future, words and things, a scrap of illocutionary verbiage that makes us question what exactly the text has achieved. It is in this space, between language and action, that projects prove most vulnerable to satire. When instead of merely imagining the here to come, they claim to have already done something. What, after all, is more risible than premature self-congratulation? That's the exact question I asked myself last June after reading this tweet. Musk later clarified that Hyperloop received approval at the federal level, which only raised more questions. Did he talk to the Secretary of Transportation, to Trump? Can Trump just do this? Like the Cucumber projector who toiled at a state-sanctioned academy, Musk belonged to the President's Business Advisory Council, suggesting consultative influence over the White House. This is before Trump dissolved it, like a week later. Ascertaining whether the Hyperloop had secured federal backing or figuring out what federal backing meant struck me as a demoralizing chore. Certainly harder than laughing the claim away, which is what so many of us decided to do, including Bill de Blasio, Jim Kenney, the Maryland Department of Transportation, SEPTA, and Amtrak. Why do we write anti-project satire today? Is it just for the lulz? And if so, could lulling mount serious attempts to redirect a waywardly energetic society or to short-circuit those visionaries that we fear, resent, and envy? In his most efficacious anti-project writing, Swift assumed the identity of M.B. Drapier to protest Parliament's monetization of copper pence in Ireland. Drapier attacks the introduction of this new currency as a, quote, destructive project and proposes a boycott to stop their circulation. Unlike the Balnabarbians he would so harrowingly depict in the Travels, Swift treasured the meantime brought from the breakdown of projects. He saw firsthand how forestalled schemes occasioned cooperative resistance and afforded his countrymen refuge from their self-appointed improvers. Maybe like Swift, we reject the future to buy our present selves time. Thank you.
Oh, there's a mic. Okay. Thank you for those papers. They were both really wonderful. And I guess, David, you kind of began to answer my question with that very moving conclusion, but I had a question for both of you, and it had to do with Swift's relationship to the idea of the book as a kind of project. Because I keep thinking about the difference between Swift and Pope in this regard, that Pope was really into having books, especially early on, the 1717 works, right? It's very invested in the form of the book and in some idea of himself as a canonical, monumental figure. And Swift seems so averse to that. So when I was listening to you, Paula, I was thinking about how does he feel about books, just in general, since he seems to invest so much more in orality and in some idea of the voice. And you hear it when you read him, you hear him. And then I was thinking about satire itself as almost like a mirror of a project or a negative project, having, again, this kind of adversarial relationship to these sort of very proud claims on the future that projects are. So I see a real affinity between your two papers, and I was wondering if you could maybe think about that a little bit.
That's a really nice way of thinking about the differences between Pope and Swift. Pope, of course, being someone who's just beautifully obsessed with the physical page and the typography and the italics and the print and on and on and on, despite whatever his public persona might be. Whereas you just don't see that in Swift. I think of Swift as, you know, an occasional writer, as Said says. Everything he wrote was occasional, and as a particular type of Menippean satirist who doesn't really have a stable agenda except in some kind of general way. He's after everything. And so thinking of that in terms of a commitment to the print as a physical material format is a really interesting way of, even the way they deal with voice is different. Someone like John Riccati, who loves to recite Pope poetry beautifully by memory, is always plugging the Pope's ear and his, but it's a very different type of capturing of the voice than Swift does, for instance. I mean, Swift can capture a hawker on the street crying her fish just as well as someone else. So, yeah, really nice way of thinking about some of the differences between them.
Yeah, I mean, satire always advances, and implicitly advances its own reform project in the world. But often satire doesn't need to articulate, doesn't bear the burden of articulating what that future is. We laugh at Elon Musk. Well, what does that imply?
Right.
We laugh at Trump. Is that a statement of support for the remnants of a welfare state we have in the United States, or for what? I think something that's fascinating to me is how the projectors in Legato, like denizens at universities, are obsessed with publication. They're constantly talking about how they're going to write up their results in treatises, in tracts, and it seems that writing and print here is an intermediary zone between the rhetorical or oral imagination of schemes like the one the Cucumber Man gives us and their actual performance. And then that's literalized when you have the bookmaking engine, which is the Legato project. There's a machine to make books where anybody without any learning can turn some cranks and it'll spew out printed literature. So I think Swift is really sensitive to those the demarcations between language and print and enactment.
Thank you.
I really enjoyed both papers, but just as a slight suggestion, just a slight corrective, I wouldn't completely dismiss Swift's interest in the text as text. I mean, if you think of, for example, A Tale of a Tub, where he, however, ironically, is playing with the importance of the missing pieces of the manuscript and the apparatus that can only happen in a text of footnotes and commentary and so on. So I think, there was, or in his letters to Stella, where he kind of chortles over some work of his that's been published now. And they don't know exactly who the author is, but he clearly takes a certain amount of pleasure and pride in the printed object. Just as, I think.
Oh, heavens, I wouldn't want to suggest that he didn't. I mean, he sort of gets his apprenticeship in publishing by serving as Temple's secretary and ushering, several of his manuscripts into print, and, continues to play games with his texts. Just think of the portrait on the portraits of Gulliver, how they change even during Swift's lifetime. So I wouldn't want to say, but I don't think he's creating again, it's kind of I don't think he's out to create a monumental oeuvre that will be passed down through time, like Pope, who, as a young man is printing his works with a portrait of himself out front. I can't see Swift doing that except perhaps satirically.
Exactly. No, I completely agree.
I'm just thinking of Pinker's Enlightenment Now, and I guess he'd come after us too for having a good chortle with Swift and Elon Musk over the absurdity of all these things. So, but perhaps Elon Musk and the Boring Company will have the last laugh. I mean, I'm a pessimist, so, and I guess Pinker would come after me. I just wonder how, we are in the town of Franklin, and Franklin was big on projects. I mean, that he was always going on about projects, and I wonder how Swift would have thought about the lightning experiment. I mean, Swift thought science had produced nothing, but almost within his lifetime, science had produced the lightning rod. I mean, which, even that, that was the first great contribution of science to our well-being. I mean, I think science before that was, it was great in theory. I mean, like Newton's Principia. But anyway, just muse on Enlightenment Now and the kind of paradoxes of Elon Musk's Tesla and space. And so, sorry, that was a rambling comment rather than a question, so my apologies.
Sure. Musk may indeed have the last laugh, and I think that there's a tendency for successful projects to be so successful they shed their project status, they're absorbed into the status quo, and we forget they were ever risky enterprise to begin with. I think Swift was really ambivalent about projects. He's also the author of a project for the advancement of religion, a proposal for the poor to wear badges, a proposal to stimulate Irish trade and manufacture. So if Swift is perhaps making fun of anyone or anybody's persuasive rhetorics, it's the ones that he himself employed. I think that it's useful to draw attention to the ways in which language constructs or seeks to cultivate belief. If there's something that seems coercive or frightening to me, it's when those speculative gambits are allied with coercive state power. And I'd like to flag that. But right, I'd love a Hyperloop to exist. It sounds awesome. I mean, I'm not actually opposed to the technological creation of the scheme, but just think that we need to be careful in the ways that it markets and conceives of itself.
Just following on directly from that, I also love both the papers. I mean, the issue, or one of the main issues with the Hyperloop seems to be that like a lot of these projects, millennial projects, is that they're just so ruinously expensive. And it feels like Swift kind of kept in view the real, just the economics of that, the alternative uses of those funds to which those funds could have been put. And I just want to go back to Helen's question as well about, satire is itself a project. And I'm just thinking, I mean, the idea that, I mean, monumentalism of books aside, I mean, Gulliver's Travels is in some sense a kind of monumental, I mean, I think of the letter to Pope where he says, upon this foundation of misanthropy, the whole of my travels is built. So he did have this sense of it as, not just ephemeral or kind of anti the kind of flotsam of other projects going around, but in itself, a project, whether we want to call it an anti-project or something like that.
Oh, yeah, I mean, you also, when we talk about text, do we mean the physical book that's being produced and that exact state, impression, imprint, whatever, or what is in it? I don't think, for instance, I don't think Swift would be terribly devastated. I'm just speculating here, but I think he'd be delighted that his texts are being circulated 1,000 times more broadly than they could have as physical books in digital form. I mean, I think Swift would be satirizing, tweeting and blogging and all that while also simultaneously using it in a brilliant way. Whereas I think for Pope, the actual physical endurance of the text as a product was incredibly important.
I would just, if Peter Stollybrass were here, he would be arguing, as he has intoned on this floor many times, that authors don't write books. And
makers do,
And I
yeah.
think that, one of the things I think Swift draws attention to is that the projectors are pamphleteers. Almost always. These are quarto, octavo pamphlets, and it's very seldom that any of this literature makes it to a folio format or to anything that would seem book-like.
And at the same time, when you think of Televatub, I've often wondered, it was bound up together from the beginning with mechanical operation of the spirit and battle of the books. And if you take those out, it really becomes almost pamphlet length. It's not a really long text. So I've always wondered about the multiple choices that went into, binding those texts together.
So while you were presenting, David, I was thinking of A Modest Proposal, which is also a satire on a project, and the concept of modesty and humility. And it occurred to me listening to the two papers in tandem that for Swift, one of the common objects of satire is grandiosity. And I'm wondering, do you find in your analysis of Swift any embrace of its opposite, humility? Or is it just the nature of his satire that there is no appropriate opposite to the false thing that he's attacking?
It's when you write about thinkers about the oral in the 18th century, for them, the category of gesture is absolutely huge, and to an extent we don't think about it today, but there's a wonderful, and when you start thinking of Swift addressing gesture as a particular part of oral communication, there's a wonderful scene in Brobdingnag where Gulliver first arrives and he is it Brobdingnag? It might happen in every book, but he, of course, doesn't speak the language of the natives. So he makes gestures, and his little gestures have absolutely no meaning. And so even there, he's satirizing the notion that gesture is a universal language. Huge debates about gesture and the idea that if we can communicate by gesture, it's universal. No matter where you go in the world, you make certain gestures, people understand you. And over again, in Gulliver, he's satirizing that idea. So, you know, again, I think he's a Menippean satirist. He can satirize every possible media form that we can articulate.
And I mean, I'm not sure in reading Gulliver's Travels, what arguments that text might advance for conventional forms of industry that would carry us forward. I mean, and when I talk about Elon Musk, I mean, the people that are making fun of Elon Musk are really themselves highly satirized institutions like SEPTA, whose slogan is "We're getting there," which has its own kind of built-in mundane futurity, and Amtrak. And I think that the highly futuristic monumental projects derive a great deal from the kind of banality that we ascribe to those local institutions. I think this is one of the hard things about, say, arguing for the preservation of a welfare state in the United States. It does not present this kind of grand narrative. So I think that, or doesn't invite or offer us a kind of glowing vision of the future. It's about holding on to what we have. And I'm not sure what those equivalent institutions are for Swift. And it just seems that the future gets so resoundingly rejected. And
One place where he comes close, though, is that in certain books in Gulliver's Travels, where he really does offer an agenda for education, for education of women, and it seems like an actual genuine plan or proposal rather than a satire of one. That's just the only one I can think of.
Hi, I loved both of your papers, and I wonder, sort of a reflection of that last question that you answered, Paula, did you discover when you were connecting Swift's writings with the science of the time that there was any real play to the idea of the difficulty of medium between, say, a speaker and an ear? And I'm only getting to that question because I think that it's somewhat sad to think that satire may be the only answer if projects become, I want to say projects have become somewhat of a pattern in our society, and so there is to some degree a way of making them happen so that people are not inept at the end of a project, and society really is enabled from something like a Hyperloop or whatever. But it seems because the medium is there's so much difficulty in the medium that SEPTA, to give a good example, just turns out SEPTA inepta all over again by doing something like what we have now in the city, which is a SEPTA key pass, which you're supposed to be able to register online. And yet, although you know, because you've worked on projects where this can be done successfully, let's say, you find when you go online to register your key pass that you fail every time. You have like this huge entire error rate. And when I was chatting with some friends about it last night, they said, oh yes, it took my friend 3 months to get a key pass to work or something like that. So did you encounter any conversation about the difficulty of medium and making it work across people? Is it moral? Is it, what is it?
I'm not quite sure I understand your question. What do you mean by did I encounter any play with medium?
Well, is satire the only way around the difficulty of medium as we become more and more strangers to our projects?
Well, when I think of my own project on the oral in the 18th century and trying to understand how these concepts and terms are used, I would say that satire is only one of endless ways that 18th century thinkers are thinking in new ways and in old ways and in self-conscious ways and in soporific ways about oral communication. And the elocution movement at the same time is seizing on new insights that have come about the power of speech and arguing, print is one mode, but really, there's a forward-thinking association with voice as a tool of British power and the future that is emerging in the 18th century. So it's a multiple conversation, and satire would only be one way of approaching such a topic. But I'm not sure if that is exactly what you're looking for. But
Just as a side note, I'd say I am also completely alienated from the key card system. I don't know how to ride the Broad Street line. I've lived in for 30 years. I also have a pile of SEPTA tokens at home that I guess are now as valuable.
Keep them.
As copper pens. But I wonder, with the inverse of the project, which is once and for all and discrete, if its inverse might be something like the program. Continuous imagining, encompassing history and projecting a sort of, or putting forward a certain kind of futurity. And I'm not sure.
Do you mean code program?
No, I mean just like the idea of a program, like a program for action.
Oh, I
In
see.
some ways might get
I
us
see.
around the discreteness and individuality of the project.
So when Swift put together and I'm thinking of that wonderful phrase of his, burn everything English except their coal, in a way that's moving in the direction of a program.
Possibly, I don't know.
Yeah, well, yeah, controversial to say, but it's interesting. Okay, thank you. Thank you both.
I enjoyed both papers very much. I do have a question, I guess, it's more for David, but I'd be glad to hear what both of you might have to say about it. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the issue of greed as it pertains to the project. I mean, this seemed to be something that's, it's kind of obvious, but I think there's a lot more to say about it in what you've already detailed so nicely about, the projectors in Swift and then, of course, Elon Musk. The idea that a project, which Swift satirizes so beautifully, is basically a device for extracting money from the gullible. And, the stinger in the whole cucumber sequence is that the guy asks for money. That's the end of it. And the whole story about the cucumbers is a way of sort of remaining on the dole. Okay, and he's presented as a kind of beggar. And one thing that I like so much about your presentation is the way in which we can see Elon Musk cast in the role of a kind of public beggar, right, who's managing to snooker a lot of people into thinking that he's doing something good for them when in fact it's an extraction of public funds. And that seems to be a sort of through line, I think, for a lot of what Swift says about projectors and extending into the present. In other words, does what you say tie in well into Swiftian commentaries on the economy, on finance, on greed, on public works, and the moral purchase of all of those things?
I think this also has to do with the history of anti-project satire as a genre or a mode in and of itself. And if there are origins to it, I think it's during the reign of Charles I, when people resented those who were purchasing monopolies from a cash-strapped king. So Charles I dissolves parliament. He's ruling on his own. He has no means of raising revenue. So he starts selling monopolies over the soap trade and the coal trade and the brick trade to people. And those people, those courtiers who are taking up these patents and trying to reap profit from these industries are called projectors. So we have a string of pamphlets in the early 1640s called like The Projector's Downfall, Discovery of a Projector. There's a woodcut called Mr. Tenterhook, which is just this picture of this guy who has pieced together from the commodities that he's been able to commodify. So I think that absolutely the root there of anti-project satire is in greed, and greed as enabled by the state. To think about a modern context, there's a part of South Buffalo where Bethlehem Steel used to have a factory. That's gone. It looks like Balnabarby for all intensive purposes, and it is where Elon Musk has opened Solar City, one of his gigantic solar panel factories, and he's bragging that this is going to bring such and such employment to the area, and it's not only going to provide certain jobs, it's going to provide industrial jobs of the sort that are most cherished in a Rust Belt city. And this project has taken billions of dollars from the state of New York, and it will not really employ that many people, it turns out, and they will be making solar panels that are at least $20 a panel more expensive than those currently produced in China. So I'm not sure if I don't think it's personal greed at the point of which people who are business tycoons imagine themselves to be building infrastructure. It has to do with consolidation of power in individuals. Individuals who can come to areas that don't have a lot of money and have just outsized influence over what the built environment looks like, the labor landscape, and the potential futures for its economy.
Great, thank you.
Thank you for both papers. Like Hugh, I really have comments rather than, I think, questions. In the first place, Dave, at some point or another, like many of us, you're likely to sit on something like an NEH review panel, and you're going to bump into Cucumber Man. The second point is to return to Helen's question about the book. I think the way in which to think about Swift's attitude towards books might be complicated and I'm recalling here a comment by somebody now very dead and very much more honored in the breach than in the observance, and that's George Lyman Kittredge, who once cracked that anybody can write a book. Not everybody can write an article. Swift may conceivably have been less interested in writing books and publishing beautiful books than Pope, but he was also a collector of books and a reader of books. And one of the things that the exhibit that's now on illustrates, and James referred to this in his talk last night, is the library and reading of Swift, which is fairly extensive. So that to say that his attitude towards books was, well, that might be okay for Pope, but not for me, isn't quite the same as saying that his attitude towards books is negligible and that he's not interested in them particularly. He is interested in them. He might not be interested in them for himself.
No, I was just thinking, I mean, I think part of it has to do with publishing anonymously, and that affects how much control you would have in the print shop or doing the kinds of things that Pope was doing, where he's paying attention to what's happening. So I think that that may be an issue around what, what Dan's referring to, is thinking about that side of things as well. What kind of access? He's not the one controlling what the type is. A lot of things, there's a limit to what he can control when he's not directly, part of that project. Yeah.
I don't think anyone would ever say that Swift wasn't interested in books. I think something got set up or suggested there that I didn't. Yeah, it wasn't what I was not certainly. I mean, I think both Swift and Pope are obsessed with books and with print and what's happening all around them. And that's sort of my larger argument, that there is this heightened self-consciousness about what is happening with print as a technology and as a format, and the ways it can emerge in a pamphlet versus a book versus this, and what is a book and what will a book be. And it's precisely that heightened self-consciousness about these issues that makes them so special to me. In Tale of a Tub, where somebody is putting those asterisks in, to indicate the lack of text there, and yet the use of the asterisk is a very, witty use of a particular type font. So I would say they're both obsessed. I just mean that I think and they're both occasional writers, you know, so we could argue that back and forth all the time. Nonetheless, I do think there's something different about Pope and Swift in terms of how they would hierarchize their interests and commitments.
Can I just say one thing? Pope had this great line, I must make a perfect edition of my works, and then I have nothing to do but die.
Yeah,
That's not something Swift would say.
yeah, right, yeah.
And that's what I was getting at, but I
Yeah.
totally appreciate what you're saying now.
Yeah. Yeah. And by addition, we don't,
Something
yeah,
context.
by addition, I don't think Pope would mean an edition that would stand for all time, you know, because, I mean, this is someone who's revising the Dunciad practically onto his deathbed. So, but he would want to reserve the right to be the one to say, this is the edition you should be looking at. That doesn't mean that he would say it was done for all time and then he could die. Does that make sense?
It was just a utopian state.
Yeah, right, yeah.
I actually have a question that I wanted to bring together, sort of what I think of as the two key terms of the papers, thinking about projects themselves as a kind of medium. And the reason why I was thinking about it this way is because for years, when teaching students at all levels, I've been asking students writing essays that what they need is a project. And I did this originally because we all have a certain kind of, we encounter a certain kind of student who wants everything to become a debate, where one makes a statement and defends it with fists, you know, doubled up, et cetera, and where those essays really don't get anywhere. They make a statement and they, you know, multiply examples to sort of defend it. And so whenever I've sort of coined the idea that instead of thesis or thesis statement, what you need is what intros should be, are sort of rationales and statements of a project, and that articulate maybe a program, what I call a plan of attack. I've always thought that this was a little better. And now, of course, with Dave's paper, I'm thinking, maybe not. But I was also thinking that there's a way in which, I mean, it's not like a project is a genre, but it kind of is. It's more sort of a medium for thinking about the future in. And it strikes me as an especially written medium. And so one of the reasons why I wanted to ask you both this question is because it strikes me that a sort of thesis statement, defense-driven kind of rhetorical structure is very oral. It's, you know, I mean, I associate with debate, literally with debate, and I think that's where it kind of comes from. Whereas projects strike me as a very sort of written thing, where you imagine a question or a problem you want to solve or answer, and you figure out or you propose a mode of attacking it, such as by eating, you know, small, delicious Irish children, right, to solve the problem. So I wanted to ask about projects, but also as a kind of rhetorical medium. So not about the book, though it does strike me that maybe the book comes into play here, but at least as a sort of written versus oral issue.
I mean, project and essay are utterly synonymous in a lot of the texts that I'm reading. I mean, they both function as nouns, they both function as verbs, they both carry a trace of attempt in the sense of the French essay as an attempt to try. And a lot of original project proposals frame themselves as essays, short compositions that try to do something. It's great that you're trying to get students to do something more constructive than just fight each other. But a lot of the proposals I read are extremely dialectical. They're saying that, you know, proposition 1 about how we do X thing, here's how it's wrong. Proposition 2, here's how it's wrong. Some of them are really systematic, formulaic, and I mean, have their dukes up, as it were, in the text.
Nobody's mentioned the delightfulness of the idea of getting sunshine out of a cucumber. You know? I mean, over and over again in Swift, the imaginative play in the satire is why I read him. If it was, you know, literature doesn't work by explicit statement, and I think that's why it's so valuable. He's just riffing on these ideas, and it's that imaginative power. So reducing our student writing to, you know, argument, you know, I feel like, you know, neither Swift or Pope would, you know, that's not their mode. It's not why we read them, which is not to say that their arguments aren't powerful.
One of the delights I find in sort of a sort of project model in a way is that it allows for a certain degree of that play. I mean, the same way that one of the most interesting things about satire is the unspoken way it is certain of its own rightness. I've read very few satires in my life, but I've read a few, especially recently, you know, sort of. But it's not necessarily diametrically opposed to what it's attacking, but it does occupy a position of certainty about its own rightness usually, right? That I always find interesting, but it also allows for play, right? And similarly, there's a way in which projects, I mean, how many of us have talked about our book projects, and how many of us have talked to interviewees where they talk about their book projects and you wonder whether that book is ever going to actually happen, right? It's a book project. It's a thing. I play with it, right? But there's a way in which projection also allows for, I mean, the cucumber episode is a perfect example of how satire works because it just reverses a thing we all know is true, photosynthesis. Right? It's sort of the perfect structural thing. But there's a weird way in which I love, I mean, for me, the reason I read Swift and on projects he's so interesting is because he loves the imaginative play. And as much as he's attacking the absurdity of them, it's usually the egotism, you know, or the hopelessness.
And I think that's part of what makes anti-project satire so compelling and interesting to us is it harnesses these imaginative rhetorics in an attempt to mock them. I mean, and part of the Solar Cucumber project is one part is reversing photosynthesis. What was meant to be equally funny in the period was the idea that you could store sunlight in vials. Bell Labs did that in the 1960s. Some of these things have come true, which goes to the earlier question about some of the technological advancements actually catching up with what's imagined to be impossible. So I think that's part of what I love anti-project satire is you have this display of imaginative power with perhaps ironic distance from what it can achieve.
Again, thank you for these wonderful papers. If I remember what Rick Bogle used to argue, and which he has very successfully argued in his book on satire, he insists that satire that actually compels us is one in which the satirist is inevitably included within the ambit of the satire, that there's no escaping that. So even if there's a rhetoric of certainty or the potential for an authenticity outside of the circuit of satire, something, including the figure of Gulliver, will bring the satiric energy back home. Now, this is true, it seems to me, Dave, of all the vocabulary of projects too. The moment we start mocking projects, we are called to think about our own investment in the language of projects. And to that extent, Swift is a remarkable exemplar of both kinds of self-critical energies, even as he finds very powerful and valid reasons for turning that kind of satiric attention to projects in the public sphere or indeed individual pretension as it surfaces in writing. So I'm not sure that this is a question. It isn't a question at all, but even as a comment, it's a reminder that there is nothing in Swift where the satirist is himself or his figure in the text is not equally culpable in the rhetorical circuits that are being developed within the text. Also, as a footnote, Richard Branson, not Elon Musk, has just announced that he's going to build a 10-kilometer demonstration track for a Hyperloop link between Mumbai and Pune in India. So inevitably, as with a whole lot of other testing, the testing is not going to happen here. It will happen where costs, both human and material, are much cheaper.
Gulliver's words upon entering the Academy of Projectors, quote, "I had been a sort of projector in my younger days." At the very end of the book, when he's forsworn human company and he's just talking with his horses, he says, "I forswear visionary schemes forever." Throughout the earlier books, Gulliver's constantly projecting from trying to drum up business in Wapping to setting sail. He describes the scheme in Lilliput to tie the fleets of Blefusco and pull them underwater as a project. He later imagines a project for pummeling Mildendo with stones. He's talking the whole time when he's in Brobdingnag about his project of escape. So he's highly self-conscious of drawing himself into the rhetorics and speech that he's mocking. And he also is pretty even-tempered throughout the academy. He recites speech, but he's interested. He says, that sounds promising. I don't like that as much. It's not complete, utter rejection of any of these efforts.
And I think that we're at time, so I think we have time for one more question, because I always like one more question.
Well, thank you for letting it be me. I actually, maybe appropriately, just feel like I wanted to acknowledge what I'm learning from the papers and the discussion. I came in with a question from having read Dave's book about Swift's abilities, or, you know, what exactly it is to both be so acute at mocking the projecting spirit and then also embodying it and, excuse me, and, you know, producing projects of his own. So that throughout your chapter on Swift, the word contradictory is, I think, important. And I saw it as a contradiction, but the conversation has made me think, you know, the place we've come to as a group, that we aren't necessarily, it isn't necessary to think of satire as having always this position of I'm right, they're wrong, or argument as always having this dyadic structure, which is something through teaching, I think I've really seen this and wanting to show it to students, that argument can be, as in Swift, more a matter of like inhabiting positions or enacting a dance than taking a stance. And I think that Swift really shows us that and allows us to show that to our students too. So I just feel like these papers and this discussion have helped me so much just to put a lot of pieces together and to think of Swift not as someone who kind of couldn't make up his mind or was willing to exploit even things he didn't believe in, you know, all those things that we might think of as being kind of within a dyadic frame, but something much more kind of exponentially set up or cubistically, you know. So I just wanted to acknowledge and thank everybody for helping me to learn this. So.
All righty. So we're going to break for coffee. And then at noon, you'll notice on the program that we're going to engage with the collections at Penn. This actually looks great. The subtitle is Tour of a Raging Wit Exhibition in the Goldstein Gallery and Display of Materials Relating to the Conference, which is in the Lee Library, which I saw Lynn setting up this morning. And both are excellent. I've had a pre-tour of the exhibit, and if you haven't seen it yet, Lynn's outdone herself. So thank you. Those were great papers, and thanks very much.